Hello and welcome to this Museum at Home webinar live from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Amanda Dennett, Head of Digital Experience. In this webinar, 30 years on from the Gulf War, we'll explore Australia's contribution and involvement in Operation Desert Storm. We'll also discuss how the Australian War Memorial is collecting Gulf War stories and items to display in our museum gallery spaces in the future. Our presenter today is Dr Aaron Pegram, a senior historian at the Australian War Memorial with 15 years experience in museums and exhibition development. A member of the military history section, he's currently working with our Memorial Gallery development team on a new permanent display on Australia's involvement in the Gulf War. Thanks for joining me, Aaron.
Amanda, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be involved in the Memorial's webinar program.
Today, this is an interactive webinar, so please send us your questions by clicking on the Q&A or chat windows at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try to answer as many of those at the end as we can. To get us started, Aaron, can you please provide us with some context about what was happening internationally for the start of the Gulf War? How did things begin?
Well, the Gulf War begins first and foremost with the invasion by the military forces of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and the illegal occupation of that military force of its neighbouring oil-rich neighbour of Kuwait in early August 1990. That was an event that occurred towards the end of the Cold War. And this was a period of hope and prosperity. US and USSR antagonisms had thawed very extensively throughout the intervening years, and it was hoped that during this period of free of alliances and free of the threat of large weapons such as the nuclear capability, that facilities such as the United Nations could indeed solve the problems of the new free world. And I think it was the US President George H.W. Bush who referred to this period as a new world order. And the first real test of this sort of period of hope and prosperity was indeed Iraq's illegal occupation of Kuwait. It had been, the pretext to this is there's a whole host of different reasons. Iraq had loaned a large sum of money from Kuwait during the Iran-Iraq war to help finance its military campaign against Iran, and it was thought of that by invading Kuwait, that perhaps Saddam was trying to avoid repaying that enormous loan. Then also to remember, this is an area that is very oil rich. Very much of the world's supply of oil emanates from the Middle East, particularly from Iraq and from Kuwait. And so perhaps Saddam was making an attempt to try and disrupt the global oil supply or supply of oil and disrupt the oil markets. So that's some of the pretext into the Gulf War. The international community came out against this illegal occupation. The UN Security Council approved for a blockade of Iraqi ports. This was an economic blockade that prevented the free flow of exports and imports and of course oil. And the intention there was to economically force Saddam to withdraw his forces from Kuwait. Then the UN Security Council set a deadline of 15th of January 1991 as a deadline for the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. Following that, a US-led coalition would then be legitimately able to use military force to force Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait.
And so all of this is happening a world away from Australia. How did the Australian Defence Force come to be involved? And what was the scope of that involvement?
There's roughly around 1,800 members of the Australian Defence Force that participate in what we now refer to as the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991. And the vast majority of them are members of the Royal Australian Navy. The Australian Prime Minister at the time was the Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke, who announced to Parliament that Australia was certainly with the rest of the international community in condemning the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Perhaps in some part supporting the US-led the same views of the United States in that this this invasion sort of disrupted this concept of the New World Order, and that Australia, as a good international citizen, would participate in any sort of retaliatory effort to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait. But also bear in mind there was a much greater strategic interest here at stake, and that was the world's supply of oil that was emanating from the Middle East region. Australia very much had a key strategic interest in that, in participating in military operations to keep the effective supply of oil from emanating from those ports. So initially, the Australian contingent consists of a three-ship RAN task group, which deploys to the Persian Gulf in August 1990. We have the guided missile frigates HMAS Adelaide and HMAS Darwin. And of course, we also have the replenishment oiler HMAS Success, which they set off to sail into the Persian Gulf in August 1990. Saddam had a proven track record of using chemical and biological weapons against the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, and also against ethnic minorities such as the Kurds in northern Iraq. So it was feared that chemical and biological weapons would be employed by Iraqi forces, either whether they be through Scud missiles or whether they be through armaments that are fitted to Iraqi jet fighters that could be scrambled to intercept warships that were operating into the Persian Gulf. From December onwards, Iraqi forces in Kuwait had released free-floating contact sea mines into the Persian Gulf to disrupt any shipping that was enforcing that economic blockade against Saddam's regime. So it was a fairly heightened, intense environment. The RAN task group, that first deployment, which was referred to in the Royal Australian Navy as Operation Damask, formed part of that naval blockade effort in querying, challenging, intercepting and boarding vessels that were suspected of carrying illegal cargo destined to or from Iraqi ports. Here we have up on screen is the two Royal Australian Navy contingents that served in the Persian Gulf. We have Adelaide, Darwin, and Success, and they're having a handover in the Gulf of Oman in December 1990 with HMAS Sydney, another guided missile frigate, and the guided missile destroyer HMAS Brisbane, the bridge that we currently have here on display at the War Memorial. This one here is a crew from HMAS Success, and they're manning the 40mm Bofors guns that were equipped to the ship. This was a weapon that actually dates back to the Second World War and was phased out of service not long afterwards. Most of the ships that deployed to the Persian Gulf, because of that substantial air threat, whether they be through guided missiles such as Scuds, or whether it be through anti-air or through jet fighters laden with chemical and biological weapons, the vessels that deployed had to have form of anti-air defence. And so, along with the anti-aircraft gunners that we see up there on the screen, Success and also the other replenishment oiler that served in the Gulf, HMAS West Australia, which served from 26th of January 1991, were equipped with a small contingent of Australian artillerymen that were equipped with shoulder-fired anti-air rockets. So there was a nice sort of joint ADF role there. This is a photograph of the commander HMAS Darwin as Captain Rush Shoulders, and this is one of the first boardings and interceptions of one of the Iraqi vessels in the Persian Gulf. This is an Iraqi tanker in the Persian Gulf in December 1990. So, whilst this is all looming, we refer to this period as the Gulf Crisis. That key date is the 15th of January 1991 as the deadline. It was quite uncertain as to how Iraqi forces would respond, whether they would, say, withdraw from Kuwait, which was highly unlikely, or whether or not Saddam would launch a preemptive strike against coalition forces within the Persian Gulf and neighbouring area. During this time, but by December 1990, there had been a force of about 40,000 coalition troops from about 35 different nations assembling within the Middle East region under the auspices of what was known as Operation Desert Shield. They were preparing for a conflict which may come about following that deadline, and that's ultimately what happened. January 15th, 1990 came, and the deadline expired, and that lays the foundation for the events that followed, the events that we refer to as Operation Desert Storm.
And so there is sort of a relatively short period that Australia is actively involved in, that the conflict lasts for. So how does it come to an end, and what is Australia's involvement post that conflict? Because I know that they don't just withdraw from the region. We're actually there for some time.
That's right. I mean, HMAS Sydney and Brisbane and the replenishment ship Success are in the Persian Gulf when the deadline expires, and there's a period of about 1.5 days, or about a day, but between then and when things really kick off. And the crews of HMAS Sydney and Brisbane have ringside seats to the launch of Operation Desert Storm. They are forming a defensive screen around the US carrier battle group, referred to as Battle Force Zulu, and they're formed around the USS Midway, which was a very large and significant United States aircraft carrier. Early in the morning of the 17th of January 1991, the Battle Force Zulu begins by launches an enormous barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles that launch off into the night sky, headed northeast towards Baghdad, and then also Iraqi military targets in Kuwait. And what they're striking at, what that initial strike force are intending to hit, the command and communication centres that are centred around Baghdad, controlling the surface-to-air missile package that helps defend Iraq from the air threat and from guided missiles, also against those military targets in Kuwait. And then they witness US Navy aircraft carriers from Hornets, A6 Intruders and F-14 Tomcats, which we saw up on the screen previously, all trail off into the night sky to carry out devastating strikes on Iraqi targets. This sort of heralds the beginning of 42 days of consecutive airstrikes against Saddam's regime, and it's truly devastating for the Iraqis. The Iraqi capability, defense capability, and in actually withstanding any form of meaningful resistance is severely challenged. And then on the 24th of February 1991, ground forces are moved against Iraqi positions in Kuwait. And there is some ground fighting that occurs, but it only lasts for 100 hours. Following this, the Iraqi forces withdraw from Kuwait, and in accord with the UN Security Council's mandate, the war comes to an inconclusive end. There's a ceasefire declared, and the conflict comes to an end. So fortunately, the Australians had played a very strong supportive role in the Persian Gulf. There were no Australian casualties during the conflict. Although they had seen some of the sailors, the Navy medical detachments that had served aboard the USS Comfort, a hospital ship, had dealt with casualties that had emanated from some of the several incidents that had occurred within the Persian Gulf itself. But fortunately, the Australian involvement certainly was relatively benign. It doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't operate in a high-risk environment, considering that at any time, there was the threat of chemical and biological weapons, and of course that their warships in which they were deployed on could strike a sea mine. But Amanda, as you were talking about, the Australian Defence Force had a substantial commitment following the end of the Gulf War. There's particularly through two missions or three missions. Up on the screen we have here is a chest rig, a heavily rust-stained Iraqi chest rig that's used to store ammunition for AK-47s. This was an item that was collected by members of the Royal Australian Navy's Clearance Diving Team 3, who deployed to Kuwait following the Iraqi withdrawal, and were able to delouse and carry out an unexplosive ordnance mission in Kuwait, dealing with things like sea mines, land mines, various other silkworm missiles, for example, and trying to bring Kuwaiti ports, reopen Kuwaiti ports, and get the sort of free flow of oil back out into the rest of the international community. During the withdrawal, Iraqi forces had set alight over 800 crude oil wells and dumped 8 million barrels of crude oil into the Persian Gulf to try and disrupt that mission. So those clearance divers were often searching the seabed throughout waters that had been polluted by crude oil, and also in areas where it's been known that there was so much crude oil and black smoke billowing from the areas that it was actually raining crude oil. There was also another mission itself following the end of the conflict. The US President George H.W. Bush had encouraged the Kurds and then also the Shiites in the south to rise up against Saddam's regime. Saddam Hussein remained in power until his his regime was overthrown following the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Following these rebellions throughout Iraq during the aftermath of the Gulf War, they were brutally suppressed by Saddam's elite Republican Guard units. This included the Kurds in the north of Iraq, who were displaced by the fighting and took to the extreme mountainous region on the border of northern Iraq and southern Turkey. And there was a humanitarian crisis that then evolved as some 4 million Kurds had been displaced during that. The Australian Defence Force sent 75 medical and engineering personnel to what was referred to as Operation Habitat. And they were able to deploy ultimately to the Girapit Valley, where they were able to improve water conditions and improve and help medically the Kurds in northern Iraq during that period. And even though the deployment had actually only lasted for 3 or 4 weeks, the Australian detachment there were able to treat about 3,000 Kurds for very common ailments, many of which were children. The other mission was a much longer and more substantial mission. It involved about 135 members of the Australian Defence Force who deployed to the region under the auspices of Operation Blazer. Now, they were supporting a UN-led mission known as UNSCOM, the United Nations Special Commission, which looked at locating, identifying, dismantling, and ultimately destroying Saddam's stockpile of biological and chemical weapons, trying to reduce that ongoing threat of chemical and biological weapons within the area, and which of course becomes a bone of contention in the lead up to the 2003 war against Iraq. But nevertheless, 135 members of the Australian Defence Force deployed to Iraq between 1991 and 1998, where they carry out that mission in trying to identify and oversee the destruction of those chemical and biological weapons.
So you spoke a little bit earlier about the threatening environment that Australian forces were operating in, that threat of the use of potential biological weapons, and it must have been a really stressful time, I guess, potentially waiting for something to happen. You don't know what the impact will be. And I know that you've brought an account with you to share from someone who's from HMS Brisbane.
Yep, absolutely.
And so if you could share that account with us, and also then I'd like to talk about what the memorial is doing to collect some of these Gulf War stories, because it is quite a recent conflict, and some of the people watching might not be aware that we are actively collecting now for stories relating to the Gulf War.
Sure. The account that I have here is from the captain of HMAS Brisbane, Captain Chris Ritchie, who after the deadline expired on the 15th of January 1991, he and his crew were positioned around the US carrier fleet, Battle Force Zulu, in the Persian Gulf. And I would like to quote Chris Ritchie here. He says, "The deadline came and the deadline passed, but nothing happened. But throughout that particular day, evidence really did start to build that there was an impending Allied strike, and we certainly all considered that there was the possibility of a preemptive Iraqi strike. By 2100 hours on the evening of the 16th of January, we knew for certain that a strike by Allied forces was on. A couple of hours later, the threat levels were raised in the force. In the early hours of 17th of January, quite suddenly, the radar screens of the night sky over the Gulf blossomed with missiles and aircraft heading northwest into Iraq." So I think what's interesting about Richie's memories of this time, which he talks about on the Australian Navy History podcast, run through the UNSW in Canberra, is that sense of not knowing what was going to happen, whether or not the Iraqis were going to strike with a preemptive bombardment, potentially with chemical and biological weapons, Fortunately, that didn't happen, but certainly I think it's quite evocative of what happened afterwards. And what I find quite interesting is that even though there is a sense that an impending Allied strike was going to be happening, it suddenly does in the early hours of the 17th. And as he says, the radar screens just light up with indications of those rockets and aircraft that they're heading forward into Iraq and into Kuwait to carry out those devastating airstrikes.
And so stories like this and personal accounts, I think, give general people a greater ability to sort of put themselves in that place and get a bit of an understanding about what it might have been like to be there at the time. So can you talk a bit about what types of stories we're collecting, objects, and how people can go about contributing? Because, as I said, there might be some veterans that are watching who served, but perhaps aren't sure whether or not their story or some of their personal items might qualify to be included in new galleries.
So the memorial is currently undergoing a redevelopment or development of its galleries, and this includes conflicts in the Middle East region, right from the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and more recent operations against Islamic State. Memorial's been actively collecting as many objects from veterans as possible throughout these conflicts, but more so the 30th anniversary of the Gulf War gives us the opportunity to reach out specifically to Gulf War veterans, members of the Royal Australian Navy who served on operations Damask 1 and 2, the small contingent of Australian medics and engineers that deployed to the Giri Valley in northern Iraq under Operation Habitat, and of course those members who deployed to Iraq under Operation Blazer between 91 and 1998, searching for Saddam's stockpile of chemical and biological weapons. We'd like to build upon the memorial's collection of objects, whether they be through photographs, whether it be through artworks, letters, diaries, kit and equipment, uniform, objects that tell a very personal story about what it was like to be on deployment. Some of these images that we've shown on the screen of the burning oil wells, for example, some of the most evocative images, perhaps of the 20th century, and veterans will remember that. Certainly, a unique aspect of the Gulf War was the fact that it was televised back home around the world. This was the first conflict that had occurred within the time frame of the 24-hour news cycle, and CNN, for example, was keeping the international community up to date with what was happening. There was a great sense of anticipation what was going to be happening after that deadline on the 15th of January 1991. Certainly Australians remember it. So if deployed personnel have letters from concerned loved ones back home writing about that, we'd love to hear from you. Artworks, any video, patches, objects, anything like that will help tell the veteran story from these key pivotal moments. And we'd really encourage veterans who'd like to share their stories and potentially like to donate some of their objects to get in contact via the web, the email address that's on the screen at the moment. It's development@awm.gov.au. We'd love to hear from you and talk all things relating to the Gulf War.
Thanks, Aaron. And you can also visit awm.gov.au/our continuing story to find out more about the development and how you can contribute stories to gallery development. So as you just mentioned, it is really the first time that we saw live televised coverage of a conflict, of war, and I'll out us now by saying we're both 38 and remember and have strong memories of watching the nightly news and seeing this stuff on TV, and so being quite young, but the memory sticks with us. And so I wanted to ask about what was the impact at the time, and what has been the enduring impact of having those live updates of Australia's involvement from so far away. What was it like at the time, and also what was the impact on Australian society at the time, and was there any?
Yeah, I really remember as a young lad watching all this unfold. I mean, the Berlin Wall had come down not long before that, but I was sort of conscious that during the build up to the deadline that what we were watching on television was that these were world-changing events. We were watching history as it unfolded on live television. I mean, there had been some of that during the Vietnam War and watching conflict on TV for the first time, but live in colour. I mean, that was brand new. And I think what it meant for Australians was the fact that we could actually see our contribution in the broader scheme of the international context. We knew that Australian sailors were in the mix there somewhere, helping to liberate Kuwait as part of that US-led coalition. And it also meant that Australians were very keenly tuned in to the potential threats of conflict. Saddam and his stockpile of chemical and biological weapons, and what was happening following, with barrels of crude oil being pumped into the Persian Gulf and billowing black oil fires emanating from Kuwaiti oil wells. Like I said, these are some particularly poignant images. I think also too, Australia could see that its contribution as part of a much larger coalition force, which was something that we became ever conscious of throughout the conflicts that followed, whether it be through the long war, Australia's long war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and more recent operations in the Middle East area. But it also meant that for the families of those Defence Force personnel deployed, they knew all too well the risk. They had skin in the game. They had a mother, brother, father, sister. They had family that were deployed to these regions, and they could be that threat was beamed live right into their living rooms. So, I mean, in as much as what the Australian War Memorial tries to tell that veteran story, we'd love to hear from members of the public who were very conscious of this period, that they had loved ones deployed overseas and may actually have objects relating to that experience.
Yeah, some letters home and letters being sent that sort of express how they felt at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. This was a pivotal moment. Not long after the Gulf War was the end of the Cold War proper, the dissolution of the USSR, and again, all this was beamed live through CNN throughout the world. So this was a time when members of the international community could watch these shifting events, these very significant historical events unfold on television. It's left a lasting impact on us today.
Yeah. So you briefly mentioned earlier the Iraq War of 2003, and it is something that I and sometimes others sort of get confused, is about the period of the Gulf War and the Iraq War. Can you talk to us about how they're different, but also, did the Gulf War contribute to the start of the Iraq War? Can you talk just a bit about that period, just to clarify for people? Because I know that they can be confused often.
Yeah, it's often referred to as the First and Second Gulf Wars, but there was an Iran-Iraq War prior to this, which is often also referred to as the Gulf War. So things do get a little bit murky here, but we often refer to as the Gulf War of 1991 and the Iraq War from 2003 to 2011. I mentioned previously that the ceasefire came into effect on the 28th of February 1991, following the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. There was the UN Security Council did not authorise the coalition forces to pursue Saddam's forces into Kuwait, and those that had crossed the border were very promptly recalled. Saddam remained in power for the intervening years, for the decade that followed, albeit under very strict UN supervision and control. That economic sanction in the Persian Gulf, that naval blockade, remained in force well into the early 2000s, and members of the Royal Australian Navy ultimately participated in successive Operation Damas deployments to the region, as those Australian frigates served in the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, the Red Sea, helping to enforce those UN economic sanctions against Saddam's regime. There was also very strict regulations on Saddam's stockpile of chemical and biological weapons, which of course comes to a head following the World Trade Center bombings, the terrorist attacks in the United States on the 11th of September 2001. There had been some looming question by that stage whether or not Saddam still had stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, and whether or not he had links to fundamentalist groups such as Al-Qaeda, who were carrying out these sorts of attacks. we now know in hindsight that perhaps Saddam probably didn't have weapons of mass destruction, as they're referred to, and that nexus between Saddam's regime and international terrorist groups remains unclear. But it was those justifications that was given to the international community during the global war on terror that then initiated an invasion of Iraq in 2003. It was an invasion that was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council, but the coalition of the willing, as it was referred to, which was the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland, ultimately proceeded with an invasion of Iraq that ultimately toppled Saddam's regime. So therein lies the difference between the two conflicts. One not necessarily proceeding into the other, but they're sharing a lot of the same characteristics. But certainly Saddam remains in power, where despite the fact that he remained under tight UN UN observation, there seemed to be just cause by the early 2000s to invade Iraq. But of course, that remains to be seen almost 20 years later.
And so that environment that you're describing is, you know, a global war on terror. I mean, that even in the news at that time, it's sort of quite a stressful period for our relations and what might happen. But that's quite a contrast from the optimism of the 90s that you described earlier in the New World Order. So, you know, how did we get from that optimism to a global war of terror in sort of the span of about 15 years? I mean, that's a really short period of time.
It's a really good question. Following the Gulf War, there was Australia participated in a number of international peacekeeping efforts in Rwanda, Somalia. There's Bosnia, for example. These were UN missions that did not succeed, despite the UN's involvement. And certainly, as events throughout the Middle East would suggest that the UN was not as willing to participate in conflicts in the Middle East. So that period of optimism had thawed significantly throughout the 1990s. And a real pivotal moment occurs during 9/11, which gives the United States moral imperative to lash back at those who had committed these violent attacks that claimed the lives of over 3,000 people in what was probably the worst terrorist attack that had occurred ever. That moral imperative is sort of marks that transition point, that sort of the end of that period of the New World Order to finding out, seeking and destroying these sources of international terrorism, which is not aimed specifically at a certain group, but as an ideology or as a concept, which is rather intangible and difficult to grasp. But nonetheless, that sort of 9/11 really changes all that and sort of gives the Western nations, which includes the United States, as leading the global war on terror, justification for the wars that ultimately come. First and foremost, for Afghanistan from 2001 and 2002, and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So yeah, it's interesting times, and certainly these are certainly something that we wish to discuss in more depth in our new suite of galleries at the Memorial.
And so to finish us up this morning, I wanted to ask about the continued presence of the Australian Defence Force in the Middle East region, because of course it doesn't sort of end with the sort of Gulf War, ongoing monitoring in the region, and then the Iraq War. We've had people in Afghanistan for a significant amount of time. Can you talk to us about what's happened post that conflict and what their presence is today?
Yeah, we'll start with the Royal Australian Navy, because I actually think that's really, really interesting, because the Navy is such a substantial part of Australia's contribution to the Gulf War. And the Gulf War is a time when Australian attention moves away from Southeast Asia and pivots to the Middle East region, for nearly 30 years. The Navy continues those deployments to the Middle East as part of Operation Damask to enforce UN sanctions right up until 2001, and they're continually deployed there under various mission names and various other authorities until last year. The Royal Australian Navy pretty much was on deployment near continuously for 30 years without reprieve, and I found that fascinating. There was something within the region of about 68 to 70 individual rotations constantly deployed. But of course, following the Gulf War and those missions the Australians were involved in following and afterwards, of course, there's a substantial Australian presence in the Middle East region after 9/11. First and foremost, with Australian Special Forces and the Royal Australian Air Force deployed to support what was known as the Operation Enduring Freedom from 2001 to 2002. Iraq from 2003 onwards. Both in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Australian Defence Force contribute to nation building and reconstruction efforts to try and stabilise both Iraq and Afghanistan and prevent both countries from being either the hotbed of terrorism or from combating an insurgency in assailing their respective governments there. And then from about 2014 onwards, that the Australian Defence Force commits to a brand new conflict combating a new terrorist organisation, Islamic State, which had shown itself perhaps in the aftermath of the Iraq War of 2003 to 2011, and the Australian Defence Force was contributing to airstrike operations through the efforts of the Royal Australian Air Force Task Group, small packets of Special Forces members that were training the Iraqi security detachment counter-terrorism efforts in leading that fight against ISIS, and then also members of the Australian Army in training members of the Iraqi army. So it's a lot to jam in within 30 years, but certainly until quite recently, until all those missions wrapped up towards the end of 2020, Australian Defence Force had been substantially involved in conflicts in the Middle East region.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that brings our Museum at Home webinar on the 30th anniversary of the Gulf War to a close. We hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. If you don't already follow us on social media, please search for the Australian War Memorial on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram and YouTube, where you can find this webinar and other Museum at Home content. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye for now.